Hi, and a very, very warm welcome to everyone who is watching. Welcome to my presentation, Sanskrit Essentials. It is a follow-up talk to my presentation last year, the how and why of learning Sanskrit, that if you've missed it, you can watch on YouTube. It should be there. But if you've seen it, then very nice. There will be some elements from the previous talk, but essentially this talk is new and no previous knowledge is necessary. So if you hadn't seen the previous presentation, no worries, you will be absolutely able to follow everything. So some of you already know me because I'm presenting yearly at the Polyglot gathering. And for those of you who do not know me, my name is Olga, and you can find me online as Idiomarium. That's my nickname. I'm originally from Ukraine, where I spent 15 years of my life, for my first 15 years, and I grew up with 3 languages. Always spoke Russian to my father, Ukrainian to my mother, and Rusin to my grandma, and the rest of the relatives from the village. And I started at first learning modern languages, English and German, and soon enough I discovered ancient languages, which became my true passion. And right now I'm learning my 10th ancient language and my 10th modern language, but I'm also very much interested in fictional languages, such as Klingon and Vulcan and so on. And the ancient languages, primarily I focused in my studies on the Indo-European language family, but more recently I also studied some Akkadian, the language of Babylon, which is a non-Indo-European language. And also most recently, out of the modern ones, I spent some time studying Fur, which is a language spoken in Sudan, in the Darfur region, which is currently very unfortunately, the situation there is violent, and some other minor languages of Africa, but also Sora, which is an Austroasiatic language, and I also spent some time studying Austronesian languages. So welcome again. Today I will be talking about Sanskrit. And first of all, I will talk about where and when Sanskrit was spoken. And then I will go on explaining what are the essential things that you will encounter if you learn Sanskrit. So theoretically, you will need a writing system, and the two that I will be talking about is the Devanagari and Latin that are used for Sanskrit, but of course you could write Sanskrit in any other writing system. I will talk about Sandhi, which is a theoretical word from linguistics, which comes also from the Sanskrit tradition, but applies to all other natural languages as well. Then we will talk about the roots as the basic unit of words in Sanskrit. And we will talk a little bit about the procedure of translating Sanskrit texts. So where and when was Sanskrit spoken, and what is it? Sanskrit is a Proto-Indo-European language that belongs to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European family. So it is distantly related to Baltic, Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, and so on languages of the Indo-European family. And it is more closely related to Iranian languages, such as Old Persian and Avestan. And Sanskrit, in turn, evolved later into different forms of Prakrits, the spoken versions of the language, just like Latin evolved into what is called vulgar Latin, the language of the people, the spoken language. And it produced numerous Indo-Aryan languages that are spoken primarily in the north of India, but also around there in South Asia and several other countries. So if you don't believe me that it is an Indo-European language, just look at the numbers. Eka, dvi, tri, chatur, pancha, shash, sapta, ashta, nava, dasha. And you will probably recognize a couple of them, if not all of them. And you see the resemblances are obvious. It is an Indo-European language, and numbers are a good strategy to verify this, because usually you don't borrow numbers. Languages don't borrow numbers that easily, as they also don't borrow pronouns. And yeah, usually a language has such elements already and doesn't need to borrow it from other languages. So it's a secure feature of genealogic relationship. About where Sanskrit was spoken, I already mentioned India and South Asia several times. So this is approximately the area, the heartland being the north of India. And Sanskrit was very influential, and it spread around this area and also a little bit further here to the south, and here a bit further to the west. But this is the main area. And Sanskrit is a classical language. What that means is that it is language of science and of culture, of very, very many texts, not only scientific texts, but also literary texts, so epics, poems, but also prosa, drama, literature. All literary genres are represented in Sanskrit. And it survives in two different varieties, known as the Vedic and the classical Sanskrit. The Vedic Sanskrit is the older version of Sanskrit, but they do not necessarily, the classical Sanskrit is not directly from Vedic Sanskrit. That's an important fact. Think about it more like different versions of the same language, like different dialects and so on. But within the Vedic Sanskrit, you see it was spoken for approximately 1000 years. Already within the Vedic Sanskrit, there is some variation. And the four main texts, the four Vedas that are transmitted in Vedic Sanskrit, you already see the development of the language. The first one, the Rig Veda, is much more archaic than the third, later Vedas, and as well as Hinduistic texts that deal with the Vedas, with the sacred knowledge of Hinduism. They were also written a bit earlier, and they represent a different state of Vedic Sanskrit. An interesting fact about Vedic Sanskrit that it was preserved orally, and this is quite incredible because the vast amount of Vedas. Somebody just asked me, is there anything to read in Sanskrit? Well, I said if I would start right now and would not sleep and not do anything else, I would be probably still busy reading Vedas after a couple of years. They're quite long, so how could it be that they were preserved orally for such a long time? And this is because they rhyme. The text there, it's a metric text, and it was a sacred text as well. So people were particularly interested that this ritualistic poetry is preserved in the most correct form. So it was recited very frequently, and of course, not one person knew all the Vedas by heart, but certain persons were responsible for different passages and for transmitting, passing them on to the next generation. The classical Sanskrit is attested since 500 BCE, approximately. And it is called classical, just like classical languages of antique times in Europe, the Greek and the Latin languages. It is a codified type of language. What that means is that somebody wrote a grammar book to where all the rules how language works are mentioned. Apart from the grammar book, there's vast body of literatures. I've mentioned before the epics alone. One of the epics, there are two. There's Ramayana and Mahabharata. So Mahabharata is alone 8 times as long as everything that is attributed to Homer. So you can imagine it's incredibly much. But the grammar was written by someone who's called Panini, and this person existed and lived around 5th century BCE. And this is quite a remarkable work because it was also orally transmitted. And how was it possible? How do you memorize a grammar? So this grammar consisted out of almost 4,000 so-called sutras or strings, and they are very formulaic in nature, so they are quite easy to remember. And why would anyone write down this grammar of classical Sanskrit? One of the reasons was the establishment of the so-called Vyakarana scholarship, which is nothing else than linguistics. It's linguistics in modern sense, and this was already done incredibly early, so 5th century before Christ. And incredible it is for two reasons: because we needed until the 18th, 19th century to realize that there is such thing as linguistics and generative grammar. But this Indian guy, and I'm sure he wasn't alone, they composed those statements about grammar. And it's quite interesting because Panini uses lots of words, grammatical words, meta language, like declension and so on, just in Indian, to describe the theory behind language. And by codifying this state of classical Sanskrit, we can now learn exactly the same form of language that was spoken back in the day. So if you are learning Sanskrit, you have to read it, because Sanskrit is essentially, although there are some people who claim to be fluent in Sanskrit, it's primarily it's a language of texts. So you will be reading texts, and there are two possibilities. Well, there are many more, but two are main possibilities: Devanagari and Latin. You can surely read Latin already, but if you're learning Sanskrit, it's really worth while learning Devanagari. Why? For several reasons. Most of the grammar books will have information presented either parallelly in both Devanagari and Latin script, like I do it here. For demonstration purposes, it's not all of the signs that exist in Devanagari, but it's already most of the signs. So you see, there are not that many signs, and they are comparatively simple. If you would be really, really determined, you could learn Devanagari in one day, but it's certainly doable in 1 week. And also, older students of mine have managed to do it in 3 to 4 weeks. And it's really worth it, because the best grammar books have their text just in Devanagari without the transliteration. But if you're not willing to learn Devanagari, you can just stick to the transliteration. You just won't be able to use all of the materials. Devanagari, what is Devanagari? Devanagari comes from, it's one of the Brahmin scripts, and here they're a bit small for you to see, but I will zoom in a second. It's the same phrase, which means, may Shiva guard those who take delight in the language of the gods, so Sanskrit. And you can see that Devanagari's script is related to very, very many scripts. Here are just a few. They are all descendants of Brahmin script, and they spread all the way down to Southeast Asia, and such scripts as Thai and Burmese, but also even further to the south, the Javanese and Balinese and so on. They used Brahmi derivatives, or are still using some Brahmi derivatives. And on the Indian subcontinent, Dravidian languages are written with some of the Brahmi scripts. And finally, so now it's the enlarged version of the Indian subcontinent variants. So what I'm trying to say, if you learn Devanagari, all those scripts will be much easier to learn for you because they function in a very similar way. The appearance is different. Devanagari is very easy to recognize because of this line at the top, and it is also the fourth most used writing system in the whole world. So if you learn Devanagari, you will not just be able to read Sanskrit, but very many other languages, mostly Indo-Iranian languages, modern Indo-Iranian languages, but also some Sino-Tibetan languages such as Navari and Bodo use Devanagari, and also Munda languages that belong to the Austroasiatic languages also were written or are written in Devanagari or some other derivatives of Brahmi. Now, if you are already able to read, the next step is to understand what you're reading. And those of you who have been attentive enough maybe have noticed that this line that I've mentioned before, it seems to be just ongoing, not ever being interrupted. And if you compare what Devanagari text says and what the translation is, so what is here that may also be elsewhere, what's not here that also is not anywhere else. This is taken from Mahabharata, one of the epics. So if you compare this, you probably realize, okay, something is wrong here. And this is not just two words, but it's many more. And one of the difficulties when learning or when translating Sanskrit is finding word boundaries. So if I take the same text here to copy it again, and here's the transliteration of it, I read it once aloud. Yadi hastita danyatra, yanni hastina tat kvachit. If you separate all the word boundaries, you will see here that there are actually very many words. And the first one, yat, the next one, iha, asti, tat, and so on. They do not appear, however, in the same way as they are written here. So you see yat appears here as yad, and iha and asti, they are pushed together, and so on. And there are some other differences. Here, this yat, which is the same yat as here, the same meaning, but it appears as yan over here. This phenomenon, when certain sounds change depending on how they combine with the others, this phenomenon is known as sandhi. And it has been intensely studied by Indian grammarians already and was described very well. This is a phenomenon present in all languages of the world. It's when you speak, you tend to pronounce things differently than when you write them. And because you normally speak fast and you don't always make a break after every single word, the words change and they become more similar. So one sound, the ending sound of one word may appear more similarly to the beginning sound of the next word. And in Sanskrit, it was very important to write that. So when you see something written in Sanskrit, it is up to you to make sense of what is actually written there and what is the actual underlying word. So what you see here, t becomes more like e, which is yeah, it's normal because e is voiced and t is unvoiced, so t becomes more voiced, and a, two short a's are being pushed together, and what you get here, this macron over an a, it means that the vowel is long, so you get one long a instead of two short ones, and so on. And here in the second yat, which became yan, it just becomes more similar to n, which follows. So that's the idea. There are two types of this sandhi. What you've seen so far, what I demonstrated, was only external sandhi, and there is also internal sandhi. The idea is exactly the same, that sounds become more similar when they are combined. And here are two examples from the English language, so that it's easier for you to understand. So it isn't doubted that we are dealing here with the same article. It's an indefinite article a or n, which has two variations. And if you say a pair, it's because the word starts with a consonant that you have to say a. But automatically, in every English speaker will put n in front of a vowel instead of a. This is a type of external sandhi, which means that sandhi, this change happens between two words. There is also internal sandhi, when parts of one word, such as here in Greek loanwords, where parts of, usually it's morphemes, so parts of one word, they change according to what comes next. And here you see, while synthesis, because a dental stop is following, we have an n, and because n is much more similar to t, and M is much more similar to P, we have this change here. So the next point, last point about the sandhi, it's quite a complex system, and it might frustrate you at the beginning, but there are good tables that help you with the orientation with all the different rules. So it is very advisable to use one of these tables, where you can see all the different combinations that are possible, of how sounds meet with each other. So now back to the roots. The root, such as here gam, is the basic unit that holds lexical meaning. So it is equivalent to infinitives in European languages. This is what you find in the dictionary. So you don't find the infinitive in if you are using a Sanskrit dictionary, you find a root. And roots are usually very small. They normally consist out of 3 letters, a vowel in the middle, and 2 consonants around this vowel. But some roots only consist out of two letters, some out of 4. And these roots, they can change to form different grammatical forms, but also to form new words. And you attach suffixes, prefixes, and endings, and you modify these roots to arrive at an actual form. And let us just examine one form. So if we take this form, this is a so-called deciderative form of gam, to go, ji gami shati, which means he or she wants to go. And if we dissect this form, we have our root here in the middle, gam, which bears the lexical information. This is the basic meaning of this form. And we have something that is before. This is also, although it might appear very differently, but there are rules for this. This is a reduplication, which marks that it is a desiderative form. And it comes together with a suffix, which also marks the deciderative form. And then the ending, which bears quite a bit of information, which is very typical of Sanskrit. That the endings are very, very powerful. They contain very much grammatical information. In this case, we know from this ending T that this is third person singular, present tense, indicative, active of the verb to go. And with this example, it is quite easy because gam is gam and it appears unchanged. The situation may be not so favorable. Let's consider this example. This is a causative form of a verb. And causative is a form of a verb that means somebody causes someone else to do something. But some of the causative forms were lexicalized throughout the history of the language and acquired a new, very stable, fossilized meaning. So if we take this form, anvishayati, and dissect it similarly to the previous form, you will see that there are some changes. And in fact, we arrive at the root ish and not ish as we have here. And we also don't have prefix anv, but it appears in the dictionary as ano. The rest of the verb is okay. We have suffix aya, which marks causative, and we have the same ending t as we just had that marks exactly the same information. So what you see here is that we arrive at a root which which is not apparent from the form itself. So what you are dealing here with is two phenomena. First, you have an internal sandhi here in the middle of the word. So an u changes to a v if it is followed by a vowel. But we also have here something which is known as ablaut. And if you studied any Germanic languages, you're accustomed with those irregular verbs that change their vowel, like swim, swam, swum, and so on. It is exactly the same phenomenon. It's something very, very archaic that can be traced back to the Proto-Indo-European. And you learn how to systematically change such roots if you study Sanskrit grammar. But at the beginning, it can be quite frustrating because this form, to find the meaning of this form in the dictionary, you would have to have the root, because the prefix will be mentioned in the chapter where the root is explained, and you will have to get rid of the suffix and the ending yourself. So it's not that easy. And now a little bit about the procedure of translating texts. So the basic steps that you have to do when translating text is first prepare the transliteration. You might be very good at reading Devanagari, but if you're not, and usually most of my students they find it easier to use the transliterated form, so the Latin correspondences, one-to-one correspondences of Devanagari signs. Then you have to find the word boundaries. So you have to think about where one word ends and when the next one begins. And only afterwards, or basically those two steps are more or less the same. You think about them at the same time. You have to you have to decipher the sandhi forms. So you have to find out what are the actual word forms that appear in your sentence. And only afterwards, you can start identifying the roots and thinking about what your sentence actually means. And then you can translate. But beware that the translation of Sanskrit text is not an easy task. You would think, oh, yeah, okay, I got all the forms, I already established the roots. No, the problem is that Sanskrit has has words with multiple meanings. And this is one of the examples taken from the dictionary. I haven't listed all of the meanings of the word dharma, but you can see there are some very, very different ideas inside of this concept. Virtue, okay, maybe justice and law can be linked together, but then you have religion and something solid and statue and nature, character, sacrifice, so on. And there are some specific meanings on top that are specifics to particular texts, and all of that is of course mentioned in the dictionary. But you get my point, right? When you have a word, it's not just okay, look it up, okay, find out what it means. No, you have to think a lot about the each individual words and all the possible meanings. And yeah, that means that translating ancient Sanskrit texts is a lot of interpretation, and with a slight change in meaning of one word, the whole text might mean something very, very different. So if you are frustrated and need some help, you can drop me a line. Here's my email address, or you can find me also on Twitter. And here's my website. I offer tutoring, and I offer whatever you want. So if you want to read a particular text, we can read it. If you don't have any preference, I will provide you with some easy text at the beginning. And I teach in several languages, in English, German, Russian, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, Spanish. I'm comfortable teaching, but maybe some can be added. Swedish, perhaps, would be also okay by now. And yeah, if you have any questions about Sanskrit, about studying Sanskrit, about study materials, you're welcome to write me an email. That's the best way to contact me. But you can also watch my other video, the how and why of learning Sanskrit. There, I'm talking more about the general information, what materials are available, and how to approach Sanskrit. And I'm also talking about the literature and the different reasons why one should learn Sanskrit. Because it's a wonderful language. It teaches you a lot about the history of all Indo-European languages. It's also very useful for studying other South Asian languages, because they borrowed very many words from Sanskrit. And it's a real challenge as well, being a very compact language. You've seen what is possible with just one word, with just one root. So it's really worthwhile. I thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm looking forward to your question. Okay, the first question, what are some resources for learning the script and the language? For learning the language and the script for both, my favorite is the fairly new introduction to Sanskrit, the Cambridge introduction to Sanskrit, which is in English, and which is written very it's very approachable. It is for linguists, so you will have to maybe skip some information if you're not linguist, or if you're not interested in the background information. But it is not historical, and it offers a very good step-by-step introduction to the language and to the script. And there are also some materials for practicing the Divanagari signs, and that's that's the book that I'm currently working with most of my students. Very recommendable. But if you are not so comfortable with English, there are a few grammars in German. that I can also recommend, one by Gue and one by Otter. Both have their problems, and contain a few mistakes, but nothing too major. And they are also both good step-by-step introductions. The next question is, how big is the similarity between Sanskrit and the Burmese script as it is used in Myanmar today? Okay, I'm not able to read Burmese script, but just not to answer the question negatively, I'm very sure that the idea is the same. So the basic idea is Devanagari and Burmese scripts are both type Abugida type scripts. Abugida is the word, as a theoretical concept that describes a particular type of scripts as opposed to alphabetic scripts like Latin and Greek and Cyrillic, or logographic scripts or logosyllabic scripts and so on. Abugida, the idea of Abugida, the word itself, Abugida, comes from the Ethiopian, which is also written in one of those Abugida scripts. And the idea is, with Abugida scripts, with all of them, so no matter which one you will take, which is still in use today, if it is a Brahmi derivative, it will be an Abugida type script. And the idea is there that you have a syllable as a basic unit, but it's not a syllabic script. And the difference is that you don't have a separate sign for every single syllable. So if you say, for example, ka, you don't need a new sign for ki and ku and ko and so on. What you do is you use certain diacritics, certain extra markings to modify the inherent vowel. So each Abugida type sign will consist out of consonant and an a. And if you modify this a into an e or an o or an e, you just add a little something to the sign, and you don't need a new one. So all Abugida scripts work in that way. And once you understood the idea behind it, then it will be easier to learn a different type Brahmi script. Also, the signs are very, very similar. I'm not sure with the Burmese exactly how great are the similarities, but if you go back to the presentation, or if you also write me an email, I can send you the comparison between all those writing systems, and then you can compare the individual signs one by one. Okay, next question. Are you a conlanger? Have you tried to create your own conlang? Well, I'm a linguist conlanger. I'm right now working on a publication, on a linguistic publication about conlangs. I'm collecting features, linguistic features that I am particularly fond of, in a folder that will hopefully once become a conlang. But who knows? Conlanging takes a lot of time, and learning ancient languages and modern languages takes also a lot of time, and learning conlangs takes a lot of time. Yeah, but it's definitely on my list, and yeah, I'm working on it. Next question. How long does it take of dedicated study to get to a reasonable level? That depends a lot on your understanding of linguistics, on your understanding of how Indo-European languages work. Just several references. I had a student who studied Latin before at university level, and he was able to translate his first text. He was very ambitious, though, but he was already able, after 10 lectures, he was able to translate his first original texts. From the third lecture, so from 3 hours of teaching onwards, I try to work with most of my students with original text, with adapted text, so simplified text, but actual Sanskrit sentences. But it will take a slow learner about half a year of study, and let's say you have to invest an hour of lessons and 5 hours of preparation time per week. Then no matter how slow of a learner you are, after half a year you will be already not bad. But also it will take a little bit longer if you're not investing so much time. The next question: how similar is Sanskrit to Lithuanian? Um, this is actually my favorite question so far. I actually 2 years ago presented at the Polyglot gathering, and the title of the talk was "Is Lithuanian the oldest language?" Which I can tell you it's not. It's a nonsense question. It's just as old as Sanskrit. But if you're particularly interested in the similarities, or rather the differences between Sanskrit and Lithuanian, I do compare these two languages in that talk. But how similar is Sanskrit to Lithuanian? To answer a few things, so the declension system of the nouns is quite similar. The idea of how declension works is very similar. Some endings are even similar, but mainly it is the concept of what a vocative is, or what is a locative case. That is very similar. So um, again, answering the previous question, how long will it take? Well, if you've never heard of vocative, locative, and instrumental, then you will be probably lost at the beginning. But if you already know what all of these mean and you can use them in Lithuanian, then you are accustomed with this idea of how certain cases work. Yeah, on the other hand, the verbal system of Sanskrit is much more complex than that of the Lithuanian, so that is way more work, and there Lithuanian doesn't help you at all, to be honest. But with the smaller words, with the pronouns, with the adjectives, with nominal forms, it helps you quite a bit. Next question. Is what we know today Sanskrit identical to the Sanskrit of the Vedas? Well, what we know as Sanskrit, there are two different varieties, and what is Vedic Sanskrit, that is the language of the Vedas, and what is known as classical Sanskrit is a much later stage. So if you studied classical Sanskrit, which is what I teach, then you will not be able to read the Vedas without additional aid. There are certain things that work quite differently in Vedic Sanskrit. So the classical Sanskrit is different to that language that is found in the Vedas. The Vedic Sanskrit is just much more archaic, and yeah, you will be. It is though very closely related. It's not exactly the same language at a later stage, but it's not like you have to start from scratch. And if you're if you're a linguist, or if you're a polyglot and have experience with different languages, then you will not have too much trouble understanding or getting into Vedic Sanskrit after having studied classical Sanskrit. And it is easier to get into classical Sanskrit because the materials are just much better. Do we still have time? Yeah. Okay, maybe one more question. I know you said Sanskrit is primarily for reading, but are there people, especially online, who practice speaking it? I don't know of any community myself of Sanskrit speakers. But I know that Indian students, unlike the Western students, are much more eager to practice the spoken Sanskrit language. And there is radio station, and there is a film in Sanskrit that just came out last year or 2 years. So it is practiced as a spoken language. Although I'd say that 99% of the users of Sanskrit read Sanskrit instead of speaking it. But mm, it is very, very comparable to Latin. There are communities. Maybe not so many. I cannot. I'm sorry, I cannot point you to any. But the internet has lots of marvels. Okay, the time's up. I thank you very much for all of your questions. And if you happen to have more questions, just drop me a line, or we'll see each other around in the chat rooms. I wish you a very, very fun polyglot gathering, and see you around. Bye.